All right, we're going to be in Acts chapter number 17. Acts chapter 17. We've been plotting our way through the book of Acts. So we started at the beginning of this year. It's been an interesting year, hasn't it? And it was interesting to see how much some of the things that we were talking about lined up with, directly with the things that have been going on. And this morning really isn't any different, not necessarily something specifically going on in the world, but just we're going to be looking at when Paul went to Athens. So, yes?
The FDA approved the vaccine.
Okay, that's interesting.
You said nothing.
Yeah. Well, what ends up happening in Acts chapter 17 while Paul is at Athens is more than any other place that Paul went to, Athens was a place that was basically secular, like materialistic, humanistic. They had so many gods. Some people say they had so many gods that it was as though they didn't have any gods, because there was no real God that was involved in anything. And so it was just kind of like, a god for everything. So one person said they had so many gods, it was easier to find a god than a man in the ancient city of Athens. So, and we have a sermon here from Paul. There's actually only a few sermons that we have in the book of Acts. And one of them was with Peter. And that's an important one because it was a Jew, the apostle to the Jews, and the message was to Jews. All right, so it was a very Jewish Hebrew message. Then we have Stephen, who was also a message to the Jews in Jerusalem. And then we have Paul, his first missionary journey. We have one of his sermons in the book of Acts in chapter 13 or 14. But that sermon was to Jews in the synagogue as well. So this really is the only sermon we have in the book of Acts that's like a complete message to the Gentile world. And so this is important for us to see because this is the world that we live in today. So when we look at this message, there's a lot that we can learn from it, a lot we can learn from the story. So we'll pick it up in, let's see, verse number 14. The last two things that we looked at was Paul went to the city of Thessalonica, and then he went to the city of Berea and preached there, started churches there. So we'll pick it up in verse number 14. So Acts 17:14. So and then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go, as it were, to the sea, but Silas and Timotheus abode there still at Berea. So Paul is now separated from the rest of his missionary team. He's on his own. In verse 15, and they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timothy for to come to him with all speed, they departed. So Paul gave them a commandment, as they were sending him away. He said, go back to Timothy and Silas and tell them to come to me as soon as they possibly can. In ancient Greece, there was two major regions that Paul had come to, at least the second missionary journey. The first one he came to is Macedonia. That was where Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea were. So he's actually moving into a completely new region now. It was called Achaia, and this is where Athens and also Corinth was. So the next place we're going to look at is the city of Corinth. So all right, verse number 16 says, now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him. It literally means to be provoked. When he saw the city wholly given to idolatry, or the city full of idols. So as Paul is going through the city, he sees idols, statues, altars everywhere, and it affected him. He was actually upset. He was angry. He was stirred inside. We're in Acts chapter 17. Yeah. And so verse 17, therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons. The devout persons would have been Gentile proselytes who were in the synagogues. They were Gentiles, but believers in the God of Israel. And in the market daily with them that met him. The market is, the Greek word here is the agora. Is anybody familiar with that, what an agora is? So an agora was the ancient marketplace. So, down in the city square, there would be a big, probably paved area where all of the merchants would go. That's where they would go and buy their food. That's where all the business was happening. And that was even where in the city of Athens, like the elders would gather together and talk, and court rulings would be done. The agora was the hub of where all of the activity was going on. So when Paul saw the city full of idols, and it stirred in him, what did he do? Verse 17 is, therefore he went to the synagogue, he preached to the Jews, he also preached to the Gentile believers there, believers in the God of Israel, and he went out into the street and to the agora, and whoever he could talk to down there, he preached the gospel to them. So how did Paul respond to a city that was full of idolatry? He preached the gospel to everyone, everywhere. That was what he did. And verse 18, it says, then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, what will this babbler say? Others said, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. We're going to spend some time talking about the Epicureans and the Stoics and what they believed and where they were coming from and everything. But they said here, these guys, these philosophers, they approach Paul and they say, what will this babbler say? If you guys were here, if you remember when Art went through this, when he was setting up Thessalonians, he went over this word here, babbler. What is this babbler going to say? And it's the Greek word is a seed picker. You guys remember that, right? A seed picker. And so the word, it was talking about a bird that, birds that would go around and just pick up seeds everywhere. And so it became to known a colloquial saying, a common saying in Athens of like a scavenger. And so, you would call a person this. And who the person was, this was a city, it was an intellectual, philosophical, city. So they would call somebody who would come to Athens and just kind of pick up a little bit here, a little bit there, and then repeat it, spew it out, not knowing what they're talking about, just acting like they think that they're smart. They would call them a seed picker or a babbler. So they're coming to Paul and saying, we don't really get what school he's a part of. It just sounds like he's rambling off stuff he's heard here and there. So they're really mocking him. What is this babbler going to say? And others were confused, thinking he's, he's presenting some kind of strange gods to us. Totally not understanding what he was saying, because we know Paul's preaching was not many gods. It was clearly one God, right? Anyways, verse 19, it says, and so they took him, they actually grabbed a hold of him. And we don't know if this was like rough or not, but they apprehended him, and they took him to Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is. So just kind of to give a little bit more background about Athens for a second. I didn't know this. I actually just learned this about Athens, but even till today, Athens is a city that's built in a large plain. So if you look around the city, there's a mountain region all the way around it, and it's a huge, just flat plain. But in the middle of the plain, there's what is called the Acropolis, and it's like a raised rock platform. I don't know, it looks like it's maybe 100 feet high, and it's a plateau. The top of the rock is just a flat ground. So if you look at a far picture from it, you can see this huge plain, and then this just city that's built up on this ledge, this stone ledge. And on top of the Acropolis is a big building that's there, and it's called the Pantheon. And the Pantheon was there in this time, basically just filled with gods. That was like the center of where all the religion came from. So on this hill, the raised rock hill, on the side of it, there was a famous place called Areopagus. And this is where a lot of their lecturing would happen. A lot of the speeches would go down there, and court rulings would go down in this place as well. So they actually, this was a famous place. Back in Paul's day, this was like going to, let's see, where would maybe that place be today? Maybe like Broadway, or like Times Square, going to the Eiffel Tower, in Paris. It was like one of the most important places where a dialogue would happen, where presentations would happen. So they bring Paul to this place, and he's got an audience, and they say, basically, tell us what this doctrine is. This is huge. This is huge back in this day. And the Lord set this up to be able to get his gospel to the world. So verse 20, they say, for thou bringest certain, and it says in verse 21, for all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. It's funny. Somebody pointed out, they were like, who's the real seed pickers here? It sounds like the Athenians and the people who came to Athens were the ones who really just wanted to pick up stuff here and there and not really have anything of substance. All right, so verse 22, Paul starts to preach, and we'll pretty much read through this without much of a comment right now. But verse 22, it says, then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill. Mars Hill is the Latin way of saying Areopagus. And he said, ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious or too religious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. God that made the world liveth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth. And hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him, or grope after him, and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also approached him. This is actually a quote from one of the Stoic poets of that time. Verse 29, he says, for as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead or the divine being is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device or men's imaginations. And the times of this ignorance God winked at, or he put up with that kind of activity. But now God commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, we will hear thee again of this matter. So Paul departed from among them, howbeit certain men clave unto him and believed, among the which were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So Paul preaches his sermon. He gets a mixed response, like what usually happens when the gospel is preached. And there was some that believed. Now, pretty much all of the other cities that Paul went to, there were some of the Jews that believed, but there were multitudes of Gentiles who believed. Unfortunately, here in Athens, we have a small group of people that got saved. One of them was one of the Areopagites, so one of the elite, intellectuals of the city. And also there's just a woman named Damaris. I think it's kind of funny, right? Like God has his people in all different, places. But there wasn't many people that believed here. And, when you look at the rest of the New Testament, do we find Paul's first letter to the Athenians? Do we find the Athenians in the New Testament? The letter to the Athenians? No. So we don't even really know if there was a church planted here in Athens. There wasn't much that happened here. And we'll look at why that is. But that's it. That's the sermon. And then he goes on from there. The next verse, the next chapter is, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and he came to Corinth, where there was a lot of stuff that happened in Corinth. And we have 2 letters that happen there. So we'll just try to cover Athens today. But I want to just describe, what I want to do is talk about Athens a little bit, the Epicureans, the Stoics, and then just make an application for now. And then the next hour, we're going to talk about his sermon more. So this is a note from Albert Barnes, who is a commentator I really like to read. He said, Athens was the most celebrated city of Greece and was distinguished for the military talents, the learning, the eloquence, and the politeness of its inhabitants. The most celebrated warriors, poets, statesmen, and philosophers were either born or flourished in Athens. The most celebrated models of architecture and statues were there. And for ages, it held its preeminence in civilization, arts, and arms. So Athens was like the cultural, intellectual capital of that day. As I was reading about Athens and thinking about this passage, I kind of got the idea that Paul had went to like Harvard, just this non-believing, secular, intellectual, philosophical, political, elite type environment. Athens was the hub of that in his day. And we see how his preaching changed there, as opposed to being, on the street or, in the synagogue or whatever. We know that Athens was where Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all these guys were from. It was just very rich intellectual heritage from there. It says that he was approached by the Epicureans and the Stoics. Just want to talk about them for a minute here. Who were they? So the Epicureans was a movement that was started by a guy named Epicurus, and he had a garden in Athens, and he would teach from his garden. Here's a few things that they believed. He taught, this guy Epicurus, he taught that everything happens by chance. The universe was started by just a happenstance of atoms doing certain things together and kind of made things that they are today. Remember, this is way before Darwin's evolution, so they didn't have that idea. They just had the idea that something happened in the universe by chance, and where we all appeared here somehow. And they saw that about history as well. So they didn't believe like God in control of everything. They just saw everything that happens. It's just happened to be that way. Just pure chance, pure luck that we're here today, and that the things are going on in the world that they are today. Same thing about the future. There's no real destiny of the world. We're not really working towards something. It's just whatever happens, happens. They believed that death ended everything. So when you die, you just kind of dissolve, and then you're just gone, and things go on the way that they were. So they didn't believe in judgment. They didn't believe in heaven and hell. They didn't believe in God. They didn't believe that there would be a resurrection someday. It is what it is. They were very materialistic. Kind of what you see is what it's all about. And we don't really know why, but it is what it is, right? But they did believe in gods. They just believed that the gods were not really involved with everything. They were kind of in other universes and other worlds and other places. So they didn't really call out to the gods. They didn't pray to them. Just kind of acknowledged that they were out there somewhere, but not really involved. So what does this lead you to? If you believe that it's all just by chance, there's nothing that happens after this, there's no supernatural things going on, what kind of life do you think that would lead you to? Does this sound like people today? Does this sound like people we know today? Yeah. And so what it leads to is kind of what we're familiar with, where people say, let us eat, drink, and be merry. Why? For tomorrow we die. And so that's really what they said. They said that pleasure is God. Pleasure is God. So we are here, and we should make the best of it. And so let's figure out the way. This is what Epicurus, his mind was set on, was let's find out a way to enjoy this life, because this is all that there is. So achieving one's own happiness is the goal of life. I got a couple quotes from this guy. He said this: "Wherefore we call pleasure the alpha and omega of a blessed life. Pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and of every aversion. And to it we come back, inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which we judge every good thing." He said, when we say pleasure is the end and the aim, we do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal or the pleasures of sensuality, as we are understood to do by some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. By pleasure, we mean the absence of pain in the body and trouble in the soul. Okay, but the person who is describing this was saying, that's what he said. He said, we're not telling people just to go live it up, because if you live it up, that might not really be the greatest way to pleasure, because you might have hangovers and do stupid things that would hurt yourself. We just mean whatever makes for your own happiness, whether it might even be giving to people, right? But you are the center of what matters, and whatever makes you happy, that's what God is. This is a big thing that people believe today, right? You might not call it this, but many Americans, they believe this. This is the idea of everything. Whether it's work or it's all about achieving our own happiness, humanism. So what I was going to say, though, the guy who is describing this, he said, that's what they said, but many people took this to its logical end. If I do immoral things and do the things of the prodigal, if it makes me feel happy and pleasure and stuff like that, then it's a part of God, right? So it led to all kinds of sensual living. All right, so that was the Epicureans. And it's really interesting because I hope you see this, because it really helps to understand the Bible. When Paul starts preaching, what was Paul preaching? He was preaching creation, right? The God that made everything. He's preaching that God is sovereign. He's the one that's in control of where the nations went, that there's a point to where we all are in the world, that we would seek him, like God's providence, God's sovereignty. He talked about the fact that God would judge the world, right? He talked about the resurrection of Jesus. So the Epicureans, they hear this and they're just like, we don't really know what you're talking about. So most people think that the ones who were mocking was probably the Epicureans. Yeah, Kathleen.
I'm sorry. I got most of what you said, but what is the actual, what are you calling this? All this Epicureans?
Selfish.
The Epicureans.
Yeah.
Selfish. Yeah. It's in verse 18. It's the Epicureans. You can find the spelling there. So the other group that approached Paul were the Stoics. This is a word that is used today, a Stoic. Does anybody know what is, if you say they're a very Stoic person?
Serious or grave.
Yeah. Yeah. So it actually means someone that's indifferent to emotions. So a very Stoic person would be like, you don't really see them laugh a lot, and you don't really see them very sad either. They just kind of try to separate themselves from emotion. All right. What is a Stoic? Good question. That's what we're going to be talking about right now.
Serious people.
They're called the Stoics because there was a famous porch. It was a painted porch, and the Greek way of saying a porch is stoa. So the people who went to this famous painted porch and they lectured there and learned there, those were the Stoics, the people who went there. It was founded by Zeno, a famous philosopher in Athens. And there's two specific things that characterize them. They said that nature is God, and they were fatalists. And I'll talk about that in a second. But the Stoics believe that nature itself is God. So this is kind of the closest thing I think we have today is pantheism. A lot of Buddhists, Hindus believe that we are God. Like everything is God. You go out into the woods and the trees are God, the birds, the whole system, we with it, and the sky and the air. This is God. So there isn't a God that's out there that made this. This whole thing is God. So when we die, we like reassemble back into the universal mind. Okay, you'll see people. Yeah, I'm sure you have talked to people that believe this. You know, we are God. Well, these are the Stoics. That's what they believe. So they believed that the best thing you could do is follow nature, just kind of like follow impulse, follow your heart, right? Learn about nature, because whatever nature is doing, that's what God is doing. So become one with nature, follow your heart. That type of thing is God. So they didn't believe that anything was actually good or evil, because if, like the yin yang thing, like if nature and everything that's happening, if evil is a part of the world, then God is also a part of that. Not that we're trying to tell people to be evil, but we don't look at it as an evil. It's just, it is what it is type of thing. And so we need to see the fact that eventually it's going to work out for good, because it's all part of God. Somebody actually characterized them by saying, they would say that we know that all things work together for good, period. Right? So in the world, it would be whether it's, terrorist attacks or bombs or, diseases, bad choices, and all the great choices, all of it somehow, some way in the end is going to work for the good, because we are all God. It's, doing what it's supposed to be doing. This is interesting when you think about the way that Paul preached to them, right? You see how different it is from the true God.
Is that part of karma too?
I mean, it's different. That goes back to Eastern religions, but it feels very much the same. Which I was surprised to see that there were people that some of their beliefs in Athens were like this, that Eastern, because this is in the Western. This is in Greece, but anyways, that's who they were. And also the other big thing about the Stoics was that they were fatalists, which means that they believe that everything is God's will. Everything is predetermined beforehand. We can't change anything. What is going to happen is going to happen. So if you make bad choices, I make bad choices, we shouldn't really be upset at anybody for doing that, because that's what they were supposed to do. That's what the universal mind or the universal God, us, determined would be what would happen. So there is no judgment. There's no heaven or hell. There's no afterlife. There's none of that. So these were the Stoics. So you have the Stoics and the Epicureans. They approach Paul. They are very confused about where he's coming from, but they bring him. They want to hear his preaching. And I've already kind of made some applications, but the things that Paul said, Paul knew where these people were coming from. If you remember, Paul was a very intellectual man as well in his training that he had. Even though he was Jewish, he was a Roman citizen, but he's quoting from these poets. He knew what they believed, and so the things that he chose to preach about were not an accident. I'll just kind of mention this a little bit here, but basically he was clarifying the mistakes that all of these religions had. He was showing them, no, God is the creator of all. God is sovereign. He's actually in control of everything. He's in control of where the nations would be, the fact that languages would be in the earth, tribes, families, and all of that God did for a very specific purpose. It was so that all of us would seek him, would seek God, not make gods out of stone and wood and worship them, but that we would actually find that unknown God and come into a relationship with him. And he talks about the fact that God became flesh, that he died, he rose from the dead, and that he would judge the world. Like this must have threw them off big time. But it's the gospel message. All right, so let me just make a couple applications here, and then we'll take a break for our next hour. Anybody have any questions? I know I'm giving out a lot of information right now. But.
Yeah, I'm getting from you that they're saying they're not accountable, they're not responsible for the outcome, and what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Paul's trying to tell them you are responsible for what you do, and there will be consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. We're going to talk about that more in our next hour too. But yeah, Kathleen.
Just curious, are they the Stoics, whatever, are these people also like, could be Indian based,
What do you mean?
like Native Americans, like that sort of thing too? Are they kind of in there too because they kind of like.
Yeah, so these would have been these were like first century Greeks or Roman. Okay, but you're talking about what the natives believe. Yes, yeah, because the Native American tribes that were here are very pantheistic, meaning that everything is God.
Right.
That's why they're in nature and yeah.
The only thing that they may or may not believe in this Stoic stuff is like the Indian. As far as I know, they burned people on their dead. So,
I'm not sure what these people did with the dead, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was cremation, because if we just kind of go back into the universe or whatever, I'd like to learn more about this, but the fact that we bury people is, I'm not sure if it is like specifically Hebrew or Jewish, but there's symbolism there. We believe we're going to rise again. Like we put the bodies in there because we believe that they're going to come up again. So people who don't believe that, a lot of them will cremate because they're not anticipating a resurrection someday, right?
But I
So
think that nowadays some of the cremations that happen may not be for religious purposes. Or
yeah,
whatever.
it's because it's cheaper.
It's cheaper. They can't afford
Yeah,
it.
exactly. Yeah.
The caskets being so much,
Right.
Pharaoh being so much.
Right, but
And
there
I'm
is
trying to-
significance to it. But
Right,
yeah,
no, I understand, but I'm saying like some people just don't have the money to do what
Yeah.
they want to do.
yeah,
So it's kind of hard for them.
right.
But I think that if they
Something to think about.
wanted to do it, I mean, if they could do it, they would do it. But it's just sometimes people don't plan ahead for
Right,
that kind of thing.
right. Yeah, interesting.
That's why they throw the ashes back in water or whatever.
Yeah.
Back to nature.
Yeah, exactly. But as Christians, we're anticipating, a resurrection. So let me just give you a couple applications from the story here. When Paul went into this city, it would have been easy for him to have been a tourist, right? I mean, even today, some of the greatest sculpture and architecture you can still find there in the ruins of Athens. But what did Paul see when he was in Athens? What did he see?
People praying to the statue.
Yeah, he saw the city wholly given over to idolatry, and his response to it was he was provoked. He was stirred inside of him. He was upset because of what was happening, and it affected him. That's what he saw. The point right here I want to make is that Paul was a spiritually minded person. He wasn't a good tourist. Like he wasn't okay with just showing up and looking at all the great buildings. Let's go to the museum,
Up to people back then who were admiring the statues for art purposes, for like they were beautiful statues or whatever, and he misinterpreted. Because you're saying he's a very religious person. He might
Spiritual,
assume
yeah.
that they were just praying to it or something.
I'm sorry, I'm not following along with what you're saying.
Okay.
I was probably daydreaming. But
Well, I was comparing, like today's thing. People go to Athens, look at the art, and they go ooh ah and all that.
Right.
And they sit there and idolize it,
Right.
so to speak.
right,
But not in the prayer type thing.
right.
And Paul might have seen that, and because you're saying it's a city.
Yeah, that's not what he was saying.
No,
Yeah,
I'm saying it's a city of tourists and everything, and him being so religious minded, could he have misunderstood them staring at the statues and all this other stuff?
no. These people were.
All right.
They were. That's what they really believed. They were really
But today
worshiping.
it's all about art, not praying to the statues.
Yeah, probably more so. Yeah, because things change. But if you go over into India and these other lands where there really are idols, they're literally worshiping. They're anticipating that today is either a good or bad day because of my devotion to these idols. That's the way that they were treating idols. Like they had a statue for everything, kind of like Catholic saints. Like you have a saint for everything, If you have a toothache, you pray to, a certain saint that he would help you with your toothache, for real. So they would pray to all these different gods for everything, like I pray that I get to, see a certain person, you pray to this God, or they were really approaching it that way. But the point is that Paul, what he saw in life was he saw people who were dead in their sins and stuck in their idolatry. And what did he do about it? What did he do when he saw these people full of idolatry, so far away from God? What did he do about it? He preached the gospel, right? I mean, he didn't try to, reform their society, right? He didn't try to get a spot as an Areopagite, so he could make new laws to make new rules about which God is the true God. He didn't try to open a pantry, and try to feed them so that he could win their, approval or something. He preached the gospel. He knew that they were dead in sin, and that the only way for them to see their darkness, to see their idolatry, was to preach the gospel, right? And that's what he did. We see Romans chapter 1. You don't have to turn there because we're going to try to wrap this up. But Romans chapter 1, Paul said that he wasn't ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation, right? To everyone that believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. So that's the answer. And what is the answer for us today? I mean, I come across some people and I'm just like, they're so far away from God. Where do you even start? Where do you even begin? Well, Paul, he began with creation. He began with God. That's the place that you should start with them. But he got to the gospel in one conversation, in one message. And Paul believed that this gospel has the power to break down that whole system of thought. He did it with me. I got saved the first time I heard the gospel, having been thoroughly trained in the thinking of our age, right? Just basically humanism, right? Just whatever you feel, whatever you want to do, whatever you want to believe, just do that, So the gospel is the power of God. Another thing that you might not see as you go through here, and I think is very important, most people believe that this was the time in Paul's life where he was the most discouraged. There's a few reasons why. If you remember when Paul was in Thessalonica, and they tried to find him, and they tried to find Paul and Silas, but they couldn't find him, and so they found Jason, the guy that was housing them. And they took Jason, they dragged him out to the city, and they basically said to Jason, listen, we don't want these people here anymore. And they took security of them. So the Thessalonians threatened Jason that if they came back and did something, that he would be the one that would be punished for what they would do. All right. So most people, through looking at Thessalonians and looking at Acts, it seems clear that Paul, he talked about, I want to come back to you guys. I'm longing to be with you guys, but I'm not able to come back. So most people think he wasn't able to go back because of the way that the Thessalonians set that thing up. If he went back, he was going to put Jason in jeopardy. All right. If you read the book of Second Corinthians, we see this was the time where Paul was around in Athens. And we know that he was alone in Athens. And Paul talked about how he was longing for Timothy and Silas to come so that he could be cheered up and get a good report from them. All right, so what am I saying here? If this is true, that this was the time where Paul was alone and he was the most discouraged in his life as an apostle, what did he do when he was alone and all discouraged and everything? He went and he preached the gospel. He didn't wait for somebody else to come and join him to go preach the gospel. He didn't go into his room and beat himself up like, oh, woe is me. Why did God send me out here? Why is there nobody else? I'm here with a bunch of these idolaters and everything. No, he didn't respond that way. He responded by encouraging himself in the Lord, going and preaching the gospel. This, so far in the book of Acts, from what I can see, this was the least response that he got. There was a couple people that got saved. Now, what was Paul used to? Paul was used to multitudes of people getting saved, whole revivals sweeping over the lands, right? And here, there's just a couple of people that get saved. We need to be encouraged because a lot of times we might serve the Lord and there might not be any results. But we need to just keep going and keep doing the Lord's work. And so anyways, we'll we'll close up with that. Next, what I want to do is I want to look at his sermon and talk about reasons why we should believe in God, why we should believe in the fact that God exists. So let's pray, and then we'll take a break. Father, thank you for this passage where Paul comes to Athens and the things that we can learn from him. What an amazing work that you did through this man. You used him to travel around the known world of that time and really plant Christianity into the world. And thank you, God, for the fact that we have a faith that is confirmed by you. You confirmed it in the earth, that you did it through coming in the flesh, dying and rising again. And you also did it through these holy apostles and prophets that you raised up. So thank you that our faith is strong, that it's rooted in the truth and in miracles and in history. Thank you that we don't have to follow man, we don't have to follow our feelings, but we can follow the very word of God and the God that is alive today and in control of everything. And so help us to be encouraged like Paul, being in the middle of our own Athens here, to remember that your gospel has power, to focus on your gospel and to preach that gospel to people, and to let you do the work in people's hearts. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, we'll take a break, and I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes or so, and then we'll start our second service. So. All right. How's the patient doing? The patient. Your dad.
Oh, he's good.
Yeah.
There's always a patient in my house.
I know, right?
Mine is better. Yeah. I didn't realize it